Thanks very much for coming. I'm Stanton Wortham. I'm the Dean of the Lynch School of Education and Human Development, and I'm excited to welcome you here to this symposium. A couple of thank yous. We're grateful to the Office of the Provost, the Initiatives in Formative Education, the Institute for Liberal Arts, and the Lynch School for providing funding to support this. We're grateful to the panelists, this panel, and those in the next panel who have come and joined us to share their expertise. It's a very impressive group of colleagues. We're pleased to have you with us. And we're grateful to Christian Christensen and Chris Higgins for doing all the work of organizing this and making it possible. As you know, there's been a concern over the last decade or so that educational institutions, K-12 and higher ed, got a little bit too focused on academic content and instrumental outcomes. So we spent a lot of time wondering about our kids learning the subject matter. Can they do math? Can they read? Are kids getting skills so that they can get jobs? Nobody's against this. It's good if kids can read and do math. It's good if kids get jobs. But there's been an increasing realization that this left something crucial behind. Education traditionally has been something that had a somewhat broader scope, and by narrowing ourselves down and focusing on assessments of only a particular narrow range of things, by losing touch with the whole humanity of the young people who come into our schools and universities, we were missing something. We were failing to develop people in a way that would allow them to flourish and that would allow society to benefit from their talents fully. This also led to malaise among young people. So suicide rates, burnout rates, and other things have increased pretty dramatically. So educational policymakers, educators, higher education faculty and administrators have been saying, hey, we need to step back from this overly instrumental view of what education is about, and we need to think about some broader vision of what we're trying to accomplish here. So this panel is a group of folks who are going to reflect for us on the questions of how can you reintroduce moral formation. It's not that we ever really stop doing it. It's always going on, and many individuals, faculty, and administrators have been concerned with this all along. But nonetheless, how can we, a bit more systematically, a bit more directly, toward the top line, try to focus on more holistic human development as we imagine what young people should be experiencing in educational institutions? Here at Boston College, this is something we have never stopped doing. Boston College, as a Jesuit university, has been focused on formative education, trying to foster the development of the mind, the heart, and the spirit, trying to recognize that young people are whole people. They bring their whole selves into our classrooms and the other places on campus that they experience life with us. I once witnessed in a high school English classroom, in a classroom in the city of Chicago, a young man gets so upset about another student's interpretation of a Shakespeare play that he jumped out of his desk, ran across the room, and confronted her, got right into her face, because he cared so much about the content. Now, that reaction involved intellectual ability. He had to understand what she was saying and understand the play and have an argument about what he thought was really happening. But he also had to care about it. There was an emotional reaction there. There were a set of relationships, how he related to this other young woman, how he was relating to the teacher. And there were also ethical questions about, was this an appropriate thing to do, and what ethical conundrum were the characters facing in the play? And there were even spiritual questions in play about why was he so passionate about this, and how did this connect to his larger sense of himself and what he ought to be doing with his life? So you can't strip away the emotion and the relationships and the ethics and the spirituality from these people we find in our classrooms at whatever educational level. And here at BC, we have always tried to facilitate development across all those dimensions, and also integration across those various dimensions. These things, the intellectual content, the vocational training, the emotions, the relationships, the spirituality, the ethics, these things are interconnected one with another, and in the ideal, they function together toward a flourishing life that advances the common good. So at BC, I think we are a particularly good place to host this group of eminent scholars who are reflecting on this question of moral formation. It's also a particularly interesting panel structure. You may know that we have a group of 7 doctoral students who are involved in working with Christian, who is the editor of an esteemed journal in the field, And what we see, what we hear here will turn into contributions to a special issue of the journal, and the students will be integrally involved in producing that. So it's nice to have this structure, this innovative structure for the event. I'm grateful for you all being here, and now I will turn it over to Christian for the first panel.
Well, thank you, Stanton, for these kind words. And I obviously welcome you all to the first panel of the two of the afternoon. Well, you may not be aware of it, or at least you were not aware of it until Stanton said so just now, but you are participating in a unique academic experiment. So I was talking to my producers at Taylor and Francis, and they said they'd never heard about any exercise of this kind before, where 7 doctoral students are going to be guest editing a special issue of a journal and helping the authors to hone their papers and make them more accessible. Most of this conference is behind closed doors, where we work sort of assiduously on making the papers better for publication in the journal in due course, but we decided to open up a small part of the conference for you guys, and that's what you're going to be hearing now. You'll be hearing summaries of the papers in progress at the moment. Not the final versions, you can read those in due course in the Journal of Moral Education when they come out, hopefully next year, but you will hear sort of a summary of drafts of the papers. Now, like somebody said recently, I don't like to be a dictator, but I do have to be a dictator now regarding timing, because I'm only giving each speaker exactly 12 minutes to summarize their paper, because I want you to have a chance to ask the panel at the end some questions, and for that to work, I have to reduce the number of minutes they have to introduce their papers. So I'm hoping that we'll have at least 25 minutes at the end of the panel where you can ask each panelist some questions about their paper. So without further ado, this is the plan. This is the first panel of the two until 3:20. Then we have a short break, and then the second panel takes over, which is going to be chaired by Chris Higgins. So in this panel, I'm going to be having, in this order, Edward Brooks from University of Oxford, Michael Lamb from Wake Forest University, Veronica Fernandez from University Francisco de Vitoria in Madrid, and Dan Lapsley from University of Notre Dame. And then I will be giving them a sign when 2 minutes are left. So the 12 minutes for you.
There it is. Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's super to be here, and really grateful to all at Boston College and the Lynch School, particularly to Chris Higgins and to Christian for all of their work organising with the incredible group of PhD students here. I'm going to focus on this aspect of reconnecting maybe the focus on instrumental outcomes in universities to the aspiration to engage in character formation. Why should colleges and universities educate character, re-engage in character education? So there's been a great rise of higher education, as you know, through the 20th century. Incredible, actually, that there are now 264 million, according to UNESCO, university students or higher education students around the world. An incredible rise, even over the last 25 years, but a simultaneous decline over the last 100 years. From their foundation, Julie Rubin talks about how US colleges sought to develop students in virtue. It was the same in Oxford with our form of education up until the 20th century or late 19th century. But as university education expanded, it was with other aims in mind, the development of skills to solve modern problems, a particular focus on science and technology, a broader 20th century eclipse of virtues. So a great rise of higher education, but a decline of character education within these same institutions. Are we seeing these days something of a revival? Let's hope so, but there are certainly some good and promising signs. There are research centres which are here at the Lynch School with a focus on formation, but they're springing up in all kinds of places. Our focus on our work in Oxford, where we have an Oxford Character Project, is perhaps one of these initiatives. We've been going since 2014. Also in the UK, the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues is exceptionally prominent and has been influential around the world. Colleagues here on the panel have their own initiatives in their universities as well, with educational programmes. There's been great faculty and staff engagement in in many places. For example, in Austral University in Argentina, Claudia Vanet has over 150 faculty engaged in a project focusing on the cultivation of intellectual virtues there. Major networks around the country here, sponsored by the Lilly Endowment. Michael might say more about the Educating Character Initiative. These kinds of conferences, it's fantastic. There are publications, funding and so on. A good start, but much more work needed. So according to the International Association of Universities, there are 21,000 higher education institutions. It's really a drop in the ocean, the intentional focus on character development that is taking place and starting to take place. What would it mean to change the broader system? What about institutions that aren't actively thinking about character formation in their university context? Why should these colleges, why should these universities, why should faculty and staff, maybe who have an appetite and interest, who long to see and to help their students to develop character virtues, to grow as human beings through their time at university, why might they and how can they be well equipped? Well, we start in this paper with the institutional missions of colleges and universities. There are a range of those. Some of those you might like and agree with more than others. We'll go through some in the paper and argue how character education is relevant across all and many configurations of higher education. So we don't put forward, if you like, an ideal type of university. Our aim in the paper is to set some of those questions slightly to one side and to say, well, whatever your focus in university, let's start with the instrumental aims. Let's start with the things that occupy you, the things that you are doing. And let's think about how virtue and character education can elevate those particular aspects and practices. It'll transform them as well, of course, the more it's embraced and engaged. So we suggest 10 reasons. Actually, the first reason we suggest sits apart from the others. We might change it in the paper to the final one after some feedback this morning, but there's this underlying reason to educate character. That is, it is intrinsically good. It's intrinsically good. It's a constitutive part of human flourishing. That goes back to Aristotle, but it's also there in contemporary work on human flourishing. And it's lovely to see Tyler van der Wiel here from the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, where the development of character and virtues is a key domain in the flourishing measure and the flourishing framework that they have developed and that has been used now globally in really exciting work. So character education is an intrinsic good. It's important to develop character for no other reason than the development of virtue itself. But also, there are then the further reasons attached to the more instrumental, perhaps we could say, purposes of the university, some more central, some more peripheral. Here's a very central one. Academic research and education, character education supports that. And in some certain and specific ways. You could think about how character education can support academic integrity and ethical research. There's much focus on ethics and research integrity. It usually focuses on norms, on rules, on principles. But what about virtues? You can't legislate for every situation. The cultivation of practical wisdom, moral courage, justice, and honesty can elevate the academic integrity as it's a focus there. What about interdisciplinary research? Well, Claudia Vanet, I mentioned at Austral, has some excellent work here. She's interviewed in a wide program on intellectual virtues and interdisciplinarity. She interviewed people who are particularly effective as academics in interdisciplinary research and found that they possess higher scores on a number of key intellectual virtues, intellectual humility, intellectual perseverance as well. The same applies for the use of online and AI technologies with what Shannon Valler describes as techno-moral virtues, and those can be applied in university programs. That's the Cochrane and Ullman paper that's there. Character supports students' academic success, and there's research that's happening. So character education can support the core academic research purposes of universities. But what about some of the more peripheral university purposes as well? Yes, universities do help students. We help our students and prepare them for their careers. Well, what kind of world are we preparing them for? Here's the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report, for example. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the core skills they identify for jobs in the workplace at the moment, for graduate level jobs. Analytic thinking, resilience, flexibility, leadership, social influence, creative thinking. Well, all of these largely relate to virtues as well. There are virtue aspects for all of these skills that could be cultivated, effectively cultivated, and help students to be prepared for their careers. In civic education, which is an important part of university purposes, take Cornell, for example, where the university speaks of its mission to discover, preserve, and disseminate knowledge, but also to educate the next generation of global citizens. Many universities talk in the same language. How are we doing that? How are we doing citizenship education in our tense and conflicted times? Well, citizenship education historically has required the cultivation of civic virtues, solidarity, responsibility, empathy, open-mindedness. Surely that will improve the ways in which we help our students to engage as citizens in their communities, in their nations, and around the world. And in fact, as broader research or broader investigation of what's needed here in higher education, there's a recognition that higher education must also support and foster ethics to help students develop as capable citizens. That's the character dimension that we're talking about. Moving quickly on, character education supports community engagement. At Oxford, we've been thinking hard in the last year about how we break down historic divides between town and gown. Students being encouraged to go and volunteer in programs in the local communities. For example, well, they're going to need virtues like service, like justice, humility and empathy to acknowledge the limits of their own positions and understandings and be willing to go and contribute what they can to others in the community, to learn from them and to foster some important exchange. Character education is central to leadership development, which many universities talk about as a key purpose. Certainly universities do educate leaders. The students that we educate will have positions of additional responsibility in society. Will they hold those well and for the common good and not simply individual success? There's a great work in leadership studies increasingly recognizing the importance of virtues to move from leadership to good leadership in different contexts, to combine a focus on competence, which has typically been a focus in leadership studies, particularly in the corporate world, with an important focus on character as well. Moving beyond, in sport, and here we are in this incredible facility, well, character education can strengthen sport and extracurricular activities. In fact, the introduction of sport into universities owes much to the importance of sport for formation, as well as the importance of sport and the centrality of sport in communities. Well, what about turning this the other way around? How can character then cultivate and help and support those athletes as they engage in sport? University sport, according to a recent report, enhances student recruitment, retention, mental health, student satisfaction, graduate employability, these important outcomes. And yet, in order for it to do that, there has to be not only a focus on the physical dimension of sport, but actually deeply on the moral dimension as well. Certain environments are needed to make character education a priority and for these aspects of sport to be brought to the fore. There's some great work, and Sabrina Little is a champion ultramarathon runner here in the US. She has a beautiful book called The Examined Run, which I'd recommend to you, and talks about how virtues like resilience, like joy, like humility can actually be performance enhancing. She coaches athletics as well. She's a professor of philosophy herself. Beyond sport, student well-being is a massive concern. We've heard that referenced already. And there's a real call for universities here in this country, certainly with us in the UK and beyond, to adopt mental health as a really strategic priority, as an important concern. More and more students are in need of support. And yet, the demand for mental health services is massively exceeding capacity. Character education can help here. Character strengths can foster well-being, can serve as protective factors against declining mental health. And Christian has worked with Shane McLaughlin on a recent paper starting to make this important case there. Coming towards the end, character education can embed sustainability. Again, this is Cornell, where respect for the natural environment is one of the key virtues. This is just an example. Could have picked many, many other universities, of course. But underpinning the aspects of sustainability that are championed by many in higher education, well, they're important character traits that enable us to lead sustainable and flourishing lives, the virtues of sustainability. Jason Cowell's edited book talks about virtues like patience, conscientiousness, creativity, open-mindedness. They're needed for that university value to be brought to the fore, to be embedded, and to be effective. And then finally, character education can strengthen institutional cultures and strategies. there's really an important emphasis on belonging, engagement, inclusion in universities. One of our former students, Julianne Viola, is leading a research project at Imperial College in London on this very theme, how universities and university cultures can be shaped in this way. Well, of course, if you think about it, we're going to need to cultivate virtues here in order for this to take effect. Justice, empathy, humility, curiosity can contribute to these campus cultures. I'm going to stop there and look forward to the discussion. Many thanks indeed.
Thanks a lot, Ed. And now it's Michael Lamb, Wake Forest University.
Great. Well, thank you, Christian, and thank you, Chris, for the invitation to be at this wonderful symposium, to Boston College, and especially our graduate students for really wonderful conversations this morning about these papers. I'm very grateful to be here among colleagues whose work and whose friendship I've really benefited from the last decade or so. So thank you all. Today, I want to share a paper co-authored with Ed Brooks called Teaching Virtue Literacy in the University. And we want to explore 3 questions in this paper. If we can get there. Very good, great. All right, so what is virtue literacy? How does it support character development? And how can we teach virtue literacy in a university context? So we'll begin with the first one. What is virtue literacy? How many here have read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics sometime in your life? Okay, a lot of people. Good, excellent, great. That's not surprising. You're not alone, at least at Boston College, because the Open Syllabus Project reports that this text is the 9th most assigned text out of over 1 million on undergraduate syllabi in English-speaking countries. So it's a very prominent text across the world. But most students, at least maybe not here at Boston College, but most students read this text as a historical or theoretical treatise on ethics. There's also a more practical, maybe pedagogical way to read Aristotle's Ethics. In fact, many scholars now believe that this text was actually a series of lecture notes for Aristotle's course in his own academy. So it's not really an introduction to moral philosophy as much as a course, an ancient course on how to live a good life. So it gives us a reason to think about these questions. And one way Aristotle seeks to help his students understand the good life is by helping them acquire a basic understanding of flourishing and the virtues that contribute to it. So in many ways, then, Aristotle is one of the first practitioners of a very important strategy. He says here in one part in the text, for if we discuss particular virtues or aspects of character one at a time, we will acquire a better knowledge of them. So here's really practicing what we now call virtue literacy as a strategy of character formation, the ability to understand and speak the language of character in order to live a good life. This is one of the most utilized but least theorized strategies of character development in higher education. Though there's been research recently from various people that really explore this strategy, though often in the context of K through 12 education. Ed and I understand virtue literacy in particular as the linguistic knowledge, conceptual understanding, and contextual awareness of character in general, and in particular virtues, vices, and strategies in particular, to help us understand what it means to live a good life. In this way, learning virtue literacy is a lot like learning a foreign language. We do that by trying to achieve practical fluency. This is why it's important to add contextual awareness or immersion in the language as an important part of this strategy, because just knowing the words and the grammar, as the same for Spanish or French, won't help us actually speak that language when we're actually immersed in that culture or context. So we believe that this virtue literacy is a valuable building block of character education, but it also faces a key limitation. It's one Aristotle himself recognized. He said knowledge about virtue is not enough. To flourish, we must not only know what virtue is, but actually enact it. Or he said elsewhere in the Ethics, the purpose of our examination is not to know what virtue is, but to become good. So how do we become good? So Ed and I have done work on 7 strategies of character formation, and this is only one of the 7 strategies. We believe these other strategies are necessary to really expand this effort and to create enduring habits that can help us all flourish across an entire lifespan. But we do believe that virtue literacy is a very important support for that larger effort. So we want to actually feature now sort of how does it actually support character development in concrete ways, and we want to identify 7 of those in the paper. First, virtue literacy can provide a shared moral language of character. This vocabulary can help to encourage clarity in our discussions of character, can help coordination of common activities around character formation, and promote a sense of community and solidarity among those who are seeking to do this work in their own university context. Second, it can help us refine our moral vocabulary. If you think about many ethical decisions or actions, we often classify them as either right or wrong, which can be helpful but not very helpful, right? It's often a pretty thin description of these important ethical decisions. So if we can use the virtue language to actually help to thicken this description. So we can say an action is not only right or wrong, but perhaps courageous or cowardly, honest or dishonest, compassionate, callous, just or unjust, and the list goes on and on and on. So this vocabulary of virtue and vice gives a much more nuanced and, we think, thicker vocabulary for describing everyday moral action and decisions. Third, virtue literacy can help to sharpen moral perception. If we have more expansive vocabulary of virtue, we'll be better equipped to see, name, and analyze ethical realities and possibilities. As one virtue ethicist says, quote, "You can only act in the world that you can see, and you can only see what you have learned to say." So we think virtue literacy helps us to see and say what's relevant in a certain context. It can also inform virtuous thoughts, feelings, and actions. If we understand what we're trying to do and how we can acquire certain virtues, we'll be better equipped to exercise those virtues when we need to do so. And also be better equipped to develop them in important ways. If we don't know what courage is, for example, or how it might avoid the vice of cowardice or rashness, we might not actually be able to cultivate the right kind of courage to respond to very complex situations that actually produce the emotion or feeling of fear. Sixth, we think virtue literacy can help inspire moral creativity and imagination. If you think about language learning itself, we often don't know how to innovate in a language unless we actually come to really comprehend and internalize it very deeply. And so the same applies actually for virtue language as well. We really need to understand the concepts to really extend and apply them in creative ways, as my students often do when we discuss the virtue of temperance, which is focused traditionally on the virtue, on the food or drink, but actually now it's been applied to technology. How you can extend that requires actually knowing what the virtue is and how to make it more relevant. And then finally, we think virtue can inform more accurate assessments and evaluations of character or character growth. This is both true of ordinary attributions of virtue and vice, as well as more formal measurements of character we might do in psychometric studies. Without virtue literacy, we cannot be sure that we're actually measuring or assessing the outcomes that we intend. So with these 7 reasons in view, we hope to sort of think about how can we actually do this work, this work of teaching virtue literacy in the university context itself. We want to highlight several ways that people around the world are doing this work creatively in their own university context. The first is through direct instruction, or teaching students directly about the virtues in a very concentrated way. Jason Baer has a great example of this in his book, Deep in Thought, where he describes a mini unit on the intellectual virtues. He starts by inviting discussion of the purpose of education, how the virtues might help us achieve that purpose, then describes particular virtues in detail, explaining their definition, giving them a slogan and an exemplar to help that virtue content stick, and then uses boosters, readings, or reflections throughout the semester to really reinforce lessons across the entire year. You might also, as part of this work in direct instruction, or perhaps beyond it, use readings about character and the virtues to help students understand their conceptual structure. Several good books provide an accessible introduction to character or virtue, including Julia Annis's Intelligent Virtue or Christian Miller's The Character Gap. Other books actually help us think about particular virtues, like Christian Christensen's co-authored book on phronesis or practical wisdom. So you can use these kind of books or articles about these books as ways to help both in class but also in your co-curricular programs. Third, we can use frameworks to help students understand what virtue is and how it might be applied in their own context. One of the most influential of those frameworks is the Jubilee Center Framework for Character Education in Schools. But given our context here at Boston College, I want to focus on another framework co-authored by Ed Brooks on character education in universities, which helps to understand how character might actually inform the purpose of universities and give us guidance on how we can do that in our own context. So think about frameworks as a way to understand the different principles and areas we want to focus on in our educational pursuits. You can use speakers to think about these questions, speakers who are experts on particular virtues or on character in general. We had David Brooks at Wake Forest about a few months ago to think about character in college, and we had students actually moderate that conversation to really understand that impact. You also might use online speakers if those in person aren't available. Many faculty use TED Talks from famous virtue analysts to understand what virtue might mean in different contexts. We also use a lot of dialogue and debate in our programs, often around particular virtues or discussing the virtue itself or how it might be relevant to a profession or a certain area of study. When we were in Oxford, Ed actually organized a great debate there in the Oxford City Council chamber. We had students from Oxford and Wake Forest actually debating, can virtue be taught, for example? So using debates as a way to engage students creatively and help them understand what these concepts might mean and give them different perspectives on that beyond just their own. We also use a lot of art in our programming. This is a great example from Lanta Davis at Indiana Wesleyan University, who uses this sculpture of Lady Prudence from Michelle Colombe to teach the virtue of prudence. She has students analyze this sculpture, its different features, and think about how it connects to certain conceptual features of the virtue of prudence. So you can see one of my favorites there, that the head of Lady Prudence has two faces, a youthful female face looking forward, and an old bearded man looking backward to sort of show how prudence requires both foresight to the future, but also deep investment in memory and lived experience as a way to understand how to act in certain contexts. This is a very simple way to do this. You can actually do noticing and naming, helping students recognize how they're enacting certain virtues, either in a class conversation or in a paper, for example, or perhaps in one-on-one mentoring. Just naming the virtue helps them give them some clarity about what it means and why it might be important. And then finally, assessments. You can use assessments to help students think about these questions. I assign a virtue literacy quiz in my class to help students really gain mastery of the concepts and use this really fun character Jeopardy game to help them prepare for that assignment. So it's been a very fun way to pair teams up to think about what these virtues might mean. Also, other assessments like the VIA or the leadership character insight assessment help students think about not just what they're doing, but actually how they understand the virtues themselves and their relevance to their own lives. So I just want to say in the end, this actually has been studied and is now increasingly being studied, and it does work. And so there's a great study by Maureen Spellman, came out this past year, where she analyzed a comprehensive program at her university, at North Central College, analyzing different approaches to virtue literacy, and found that actually it does actually increase the salience of certain virtues. It helps students recognize virtues in different situations and makes them much more aware of how to apply that concept in different areas. So with that, I'll conclude. I just want to say thanks again to everyone here. We know that virtue literacy itself is not enough. We need more than just virtue literacy, but it's a great first start to do this work in a university context. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you in particular for being exactly on time. So, character education in universities is not only popular in the UK and the USA, it's also gaining ground in Europe and other parts of the world, and we've got with us Veronica Fernandez from Spain.
Well, thank you very much, Christian and Chris, for the invitation, and it has been wonderful to be here and enjoying with you all, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Sorry if my English sometimes may be not clear. I will try to do my best. So I think what I'm going to present to you, it's a very pedagogical tool. You know, we're working in our university on also on character education programs within our university, and we have some programs there. But above all, the most important thing is how to create an ethos, you know, where this can be not just about programs, but about how it's embedded in all what we do. But at the same time, we need to assess and we need to see how things are working there. So I'm going to see how we have the formative assessment for virtue-based university leadership education. So this is just a program, and how are we using some instruments to measure, you know, some virtues and how our students are growing or not in them, and how this instrument is not just an instrument to see, it's not to measure virtue, it's an instrument to help students grow. So I will explain to you a little bit how does it work. So just to say that many universities all over the world like intentionally say in their mission statement that they want to, you know, to have leaders. We see that we are in a leadership crisis all over the world. You know, in Spain, a lot, in every field, you know. So it's a question like, what type of leaders are we really educating in our institutions? Are we really having good good educational programs and models for our students to follow so they can become the leaders of tomorrow. So having this, we have developed a model of leadership education. I'm going to go fast on this, just to go to the core of what we're trying to present. We have seen all the things that work on leadership education. There are many strategies, instruction and dialogue and practice opportunities, et cetera. But what we know helps the most is the teacher. The person who is really there teaching. We are not mere transmitters of knowledge, but our whole person, helps our students transform. So having in mind all these strategies that work on leadership education and having in mind the crucial role of the educator, we have created the EduLead. It stands for leadership in Spanish, Educación de Liderazgo for the ones that know Spanish. And we have developed some strategies like a model and some strategies for leadership education that are really much aligned also with the Oxford Character Project and all the leadership things that they are doing. So are the ones that are self-knowledge, educational accompaniment, emulation, practice reflection, interaction with reality, instruction, and aesthetics. So having this in mind, and we're carrying out our program, we have this model of leadership education for university students. And for us, it was important to define what do we mean by leadership? Because if I ask here, what do you mean by leadership? We can have so many answers. So in order to have a program, we needed to have a really specific definition so we can form according to this definition. So for us, the definition is leadership is the human act of guiding others towards the common good. And okay, how do we do that? If leadership is a human action, it's a human act, and it's about guiding others, how do we do it? So we have some educational domains. There are 3 that are understanding reality, that it's linked to the virtue of prudence, relating to others, that is related to the virtue of justice, and dedication to the task, that it's linked to the virtue of fortitude and temperance. And we try, they are all related also to our faculties, the intellect, will, affectivity, that it goes embedded into all the human act. And they are related also to competences. We are linking, at least in Spain, all the educational programs are very much linked to competences, but now we're adding also virtues. For sure you have seen the movie Ocean's 12. You have there this, I forgot, the leader, the great leader, he's George Clooney. George Clooney. So he gets extremely competent people, but for what? To steal a bank. So competence is not enough. We want extremely competent people, but also with character, with virtue, so they can do so much good in the world. So I think maybe this difference may help a little bit. So this is our model, and based on this model, we created a questionnaire that has 45 items that measures these 9 competences that are related to the cardinal virtues. So, and we have developed some, like a questionnaire for the students fill out this questionnaire, and they received, okay, this is not who you are, because sometimes we think, oh, this is me, no. These are opportunities for you of growth. It's just like a map, but that says something because it's a self-perception questionnaire, so that may say where you are and which are your opportunities to grow. It's never to see, okay, this is me, like maybe when a DISC questionnaire, DISC, you are green or you are yellow. No, it's not about, you are not that. These are just, it's a tool. So we can start a conversation, so we can have a mentor conversation with our students, so, to have a starting point to work with them. Okay, so, our question was is this really being effective? Applying this questionnaire, is it helpful for our students? Is the faculty that is using this questionnaire, is it useful for them? Is it being a tool that helps them to be a formative evaluation process? So, we passed this questionnaire to our students. We're 60 students who were taking this program. the reliability. This tool was already proved in 3 countries, in Spain, in Mexico, and in Chile. But now we just took this to apply it for these 60 students. And it was reliable. So the findings we find is that our students, the ones that were taking this program, they have really high competence in commitment, very low in self-mastery, followed by resilience. And we saw some domains ranking between the relational, the cognitive, and the performative. And there were no difference between sex. So it's like the program, it's for everybody. So we can see that students were strong in ideas and relationship, but very weak in perseverance and emotional regulation. So, and then we can see we did 30 interviews with our students and with faculty members to see if this was really working. And after analyzing these 30 interviews, we saw that the students recognize their strengths and their weaknesses. So this is good, you know, like, okay, this is the opportunities, this is where I have because Virtue is about growing, so you can see where you are, you have strengths, but you have also opportunities to grow. And then they reflected on leadership as an ethical and relational practice. And then they developed personal growth plans with mentors. So this tool helped them for that, you know, because if not, you can have a course and okay, but then how can I help you to grow? And we have here some things that the students say. For example, I left with a desire to become more organized, more consistent, and to connect my way of thinking with my actions. Imagine, like, a way of connecting my thinking to my actions. Yeah, I can give you tons of examples. Like, I have a student that said, like, yes, I feel I'm extremely grateful, but I never say thanks. I feel thankful because they are really emotional, but how can they translate that into action? There's a gap there, you know, so it was really important. Or this one, he's studying psychology, you know. I didn't see myself as a leader, but it made me realize that leadership is also about looking at the person, it's establishing a relation and not just solving problems. Okay, so this is. And then in the qualitative results for the lecturers, they said that lead supported self-awareness, mentoring as a dialogical and formative process. It helps set actionable goals and fosters community and psychological safety. So this is something that really helped our students. For example, he says, it is vital for students to live with a life plan in place that helps them become aware of the aspects they need to pay attention to in their daily lives in order to grow in areas they consider to be their Achilles heels. Okay, so this is one of the thing that were says. And just to finish, that LIT questionnaire is more than a diagnostic tool. So it's a formative tool, to say so. It becomes formative, that helps students construct leadership narratives, moral identity, and self-knowledge. We see, as I said, they rate themselves lower in resilience and self-mastery and need to cultivate fortitude and temperance. So it also helps us as faculty to see how can we help them to do that. And leadership education must prioritize character formation, integrating mentoring, experiential learning within university. And there's a limitation. This can be generalized. It was in my university in Spain in a small context. So we need to do more studies and to see if this is useful in other places. There's some future research. And the study shows that systematic use of diagnostic tools, like the one I show you, within mission-aligned frameworks can strengthen virtue formation and prepare morally grounded leaders capable of meeting today's complex challenges. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Three academics and all exactly on time. This must be a miracle. Well, let's see what happens with Dan Lapsley. Dan.
I'm sure I'm going to test the virtues of our dictator moderator here. So let me begin by saying that preparing students to flourish in post-baccalaureate careers is one way to understand a university's mission to educate students to live a good life. Certainly, the prospect of living a good life is an ambition that many university students and their parents readily endorse as an important educational objective, and this is most often understood in vocational terms as choices of career. Study everything, do anything is the tagline of a prominent Catholic university, the other one, that emphasizes the value of liberal arts in preparing students to undertake a variety of careers, vocational passions, and life pursuits. But living a good life and living a life that is good to live are quite different things, which the study of the liberal arts, it must be said, should make abundantly clear. Philosopher Christine McKinnon points out the two ways that a good human life can be understood. There is, first of all, a functional good life, one that is personally satisfying, one that yields a good career, makes a good living, and otherwise permits achievement of various goods associated with flourishing. These are the things typically measured by the various constructs of positive psychology. But there's also an ethical sense of a good life. This good life is ethically praiseworthy if the person leading it is moved to act by ethically admirable considerations. This ethically good life is animated by a vision of the good, or as Charles Taylor would put it, by an ethical framework or a horizon of significance that provides a basis for strong evaluation about what is worthy and unworthy, noble or base, higher or lower with respect to our desires and ambitions and aspirations. Certainly the functional good life is within the remit of higher education. It's certainly within the remit of higher education for students to matriculate with what philosopher John Keeks called a legislative character, the disposition to pursue and achieve a functionally good life conventionally understood. The challenge of higher education is to show how a functional good life driven by these substantive desires requires an ethical sense so that the person leading it could construct a self-identity around moral convictions and be capable of strong evaluation and pursuit of them, with the promise that this sort of life is good for one to live. The challenge of higher education is to show how legislative character can be transformed into judicial character, how substantive desires can be guided by regulative ones. How to transmute the functional good life into one of ethical significance is a challenging value proposition of higher education. But there's a second challenge that confronts the moral self, even if good character is the determinative goal, and even if a vision of the ultimate good of flourishing is in main sight. This is the challenge of St. Paul, noted in the epigram. I fail to carry out the things I want to do, and I find myself doing the very things I hate. How are we to understand St. Paul's lament? Perhaps the lament is best attributed to weakness of will, or the failure of phronesis by the philosophers, or the judgment-action gap by the psychologists, or the ubiquity of sin by the theologians. But most certainly, facing up to this challenge does not show up in the mission statement of our universities, nor is it defeated, I would argue, by putting on the armor of virtue. Instead, we have to face what John Keeks has called the permanent adversities of conflict, contingency, and evil, and there could be others. These adversities are not infrequent calamities that befall unfortunate lives, but are instead an inescapably common feature of creatures like us. In his view, the permanent adversities are in us as well as outside of us. It is human agency itself that is permeated by contingency, conflict, and evil. So no effort of ours could succeed in getting rid of them. Yet we cope with the adversities even if we cannot defeat them, insofar as we're able to cultivate what Keeks calls moral wisdom. For Keeks, moral wisdom is a second-order psychological capacity that enables individuals to judge rightly in important matters. As a second-order capacity, it is metacognitive. As a psychological capacity, it can be developed, like all capacities, and possessed by degree. Moreover, to the extent that moral wisdom takes root and endures, it can be considered a character trait and also a virtue if this trait is prized, valued, and admired. So in short, moral wisdom is both metacognitive and personological. So the moral purpose of higher education then is twofold, and like any good football game plan, there is a plan for offense and one for defense. First, to play offense. One moral purpose of higher education is to help students consolidate the development of moral self-identity around ethical frameworks that are action guiding for the long haul across the life course. This will require developing an orientation to the good that becomes essential to identity and for building a character fit for moral purpose. It will require increasing capacity for strong evaluation about the worthiness of our desires and about the kinds of life worth living. How to improve articulacy about moral framework should figure into accounts of moral formation in higher education. And on these points, my debt to Charles Taylor is obvious. Second, to play defense, formation of the moral self that's fit for purpose will also need to be fortified with facets of moral wisdom that make it possible to confront the permanent adversities, and in this way provide a way to cope with the inevitable confounding of moral character so memorably lamented by St. Paul. John Keeks has some ideas about what moral wisdom amounts to. I understand them as standard features of metacognition that was drawn from the educational and learning sciences. And I was prepared to go in detail about my game plan, but now I'm not. I'm going to skip to the end because my dictator here is going to look at me askance. I'm going to just skip. As you see, I don't need to go into this detail. There's metacognition, blah, blah, da, 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 boom, 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 ba, bam. I can hear the cheering. I can hear the cheerleaders. I hear everything going on. See, okay, let's recap. Delay of game. I don't want any delay of game penalty here, so let's recap. Okay, let me get here. Bear with me, Coach. All right. So higher education is a context where functional good life is considered from the perspective of a life good to live. It's a context where legislative character must pass judicial oversight, where substantive desires are traded for regulative ones, where we enact a commitment to develop a character, a moral self-identity, organized around ethical frameworks that serve as the basis for qualitative discriminations. Strong evaluations make visible ethical frameworks, the horizon of significance that is the ground for self-identity. Higher education should improve students' articulacy in using strongly evaluative language. Okay. And to move ethical reflection to explicitly considered, chronically accessible forefront of deliberative character. Okay, so that's the offensive game plan and the defensive game plan. Okay. I want to end with some concluding lessons and say a word about articulacy and the moral character of universities. How does higher education deliver strong evaluation, articulacy, and the metacognitive features of moral wisdom? First, it must be said that moral character formation is imminent to all forms of education wherever there is reflection and discussion of right relations and what is worth doing. Recurring waves of cultural panic notwithstanding, it has never been absent from higher education or at any level. There is inevitable instruction in virtues in any well-run seminar, for example. And as the Jubilee Center Framework for Character and Virtues points out, values can be caught, if not explicitly taught, in schools where values are infused, modeled, or otherwise embedded in the hidden curriculum. And this is undoubtedly as true for higher as to secondary education. So moral formation is already part of the collegiate experience, although perhaps in ways fortuitous and inchoate. Of course, values can also be taught as well as caught. Many of the moral frameworks that guide legislative character is unproblematic background knowledge, something tacit, unspoken, until a moment of crisis forces us to spell it out and defend. Okay. Higher education should provide moments like this in the normal course of things, and there is a compelling case to be made for articulacy. Let me spell some out that comes from Charles Taylor's theory. For example, the very exercise of strong evaluation across the many domains of experience is a way of articulating ethical frameworks. Taylor writes, when we try to spell out what it is we suppose when we judge that a certain form of life is truly worthwhile, or place our dignity in a certain achievement or status, or define our moral obligations in a certain way, we find ourselves articulating inter alia what I've been calling here frameworks. And given the tight connection that Taylor draws between selfhood and morality, articulating frameworks also contributes to self-knowledge and transparency. I should think it a sign of moral progress and not despair that individuals at some point in their moral formation find themselves uttering something like St. Paul's lament in the epigram. Moreover, articulating the background to our values forces us to recognize the complexity of moral life and different sources. Got it. Checking our tendency to simplicity and reductionism, but also increasing the tendency of rational debate and evaluation of moral goods. Articulation also empowers. It identifies what we find moving and why we love committing to it. On this point, Taylor is credited for bringing out the erotic aspects of articulacy and the moral life. A final point about articulacy. Philosophical analysis is not the only form, and indeed it might be the weakest form. Other forms of articulation include poetry, literature, the visual and performing arts, prayer, ritual, the experience of aesthetic or religious awe, or the mysteries and conundrums of science, the lessons of history. These are the disciplines of the university. These are the disciplinary tools available to higher education to advance the moral formation of students, but only if institutions of higher education seize them with a sense of deliberative purpose. There is also something we can call the moral character of universities. Institutions also have an obligation for strong evaluation of impediments to living out the lofty goals of their mission statements. We should as much be concerned about the moral character of universities as we are about the moral character of students. Indeed, it's hard to imagine how there can be much progress with students when university character is itself inchoate and dim and inarticulate. Universities also drift in fortuitous ways, just like emerging adults, content with conventional priorities and metrics of legislative character, such as their grants or their status or their matriculation rates or their rankings. But they also have as much obligation to develop their institutional judicial character and to articulate with bracing clarity the horizon of significance that animate their core values, as do students whose character is on the syllabus. Students and institutions must walk the same developmental journey to moral wisdom together, face to face, or else see through the glass darkly the permanent adversities that shadow the way forward. So I end my remarks as I began them with St. Paul the Evangelist. Amen. That's my bit. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. So thank you to our four speakers in this panel, and we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. So there are students walking around with microphones, so could you please raise your arm, and then if you want to ask a question, when the microphone comes to you, please tell us your name and then indicate clearly which of the four panelists you want to ask a question to.
Hi, I'm Mira Levinson. I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I have a question actually for Edward and Daniel together, contrasting it with how I heard Michael and Veronica. So arguably, there are ways to hear the first and the last presentations as being arguments in favor of a certain kind of substantive moral education that universities undertake, whereas from Michael and Veronica, we were hearing arguments about sort of individual virtues and articulacy about those individual virtues, but not necessarily knitted into one substantive vision. Whereas, say, where Edward was talking about taking the mission statements of universities and saying, see, we can connect character education to those mission statements, and where Daniel was talking about moving from a legislative to, say, judicial conception of virtue, what I was hearing was something sort of more substantive and complex and united. Arguably, many universities have been committed to that kind of substantive vision and are getting into trouble precisely for that right now in the United States, where they had substantive commitments and were teaching substantive commitments to a certain conception of social justice, or the responsibilities of elite educated students to take on roles in the world that were driven by a sort of a pretty substantive conception of what justice, commitments to equality, belonging, inclusion, et cetera, looked like. And it is that very substantive commitment that is right now coming under attack precisely because it is seen to be undercutting the role of the university as an intellectually diverse, open place to people with a whole wide variety of political viewpoints. So I'm curious to hear the two of you talk a bit more about the ways in which you are calling for universities to be more articulate and committed to character education, when universities, at least in the United States, are right now, and I should say I'm coming from Harvard right now, so this feels very personal, right, are right now coming under attack for some of the kind of substantive commitments that they have at least claimed to make, no matter how successful we view them as having been.
Thank you very much. Is that working? Yeah. So I should say that the paper I presented first was with Michael as well. We co-authored that paper and co-authored the paper that Michael's working on. We're working together on a bigger book project on strategies to cultivate character in higher education. And so I guess we don't see at all a sense that these are working at odds with each other. If you like, my read of the 4 papers would be that Dan presented a beautifully substantive vision of character education in universities, and I think that's super, and maybe let you come back to that and the articulacy points, which I absolutely agree with. My presentation was more pragmatic. Okay, how do we connect with what's actually happening in universities and some of the discourses that are going on and the interests and instrumental aspects? How do we elevate those? But of course, you've got to have the focus on, well, how do you do that? We might all agree, okay, virtues are relevant for all of these aims. You know, how do you then go about educating for those? Michael shared one of 7 strategies we've been working on alongside virtue literacy. He shared some of the others, habituation through practice engagement with exemplars, and Veronica's focus on one aspect in leadership, education, and cultivating virtues there. So I guess I'd see those not as working against each other, but as different aspects of this same whole story. Dan, do you want to keep talking more about the articulacy point, or do you want to take this up?
I guess, is this on? I guess my entree into this is from the psychology side. Psychologically, I've been writing on the importance of moral self-identity as a way of understanding character and virtue. So there's different ways of understanding character. There's a kind of a trait approach. That trait language comes easy to people. I don't necessarily use that language. I prefer to use the language of social cognition and moral identity and whatnot. So my entree into moral self-identity comes from social cognitive personality theory, but it also comes from Charles Taylor. I think Charles Taylor has been very influential in the way I think about things, because he understands that there's an inextricable link between morality and selfhood. You know, and he makes very strong claims that you cannot be a self without making the capacity for strong evaluation about things. And so hence my embrace of Charles Taylor. He shows up a lot in my work. And Charles Taylor would argue, and others, that we cannot be a functioning self, have a functioning personality, unless we have the capacity to make strong evaluation about things that matter. And universities should be, and we should be confronting students with important questions that matter, because only when they wrestle with that would they be able to make the kinds of identifications that in fact are character defining, that forms their self-identity. Now one question that we took up this morning in our closed group is, or maybe I'm the only one who took it up, is that do universities of faith have an easier go of it? You know, do we have, because we have a gospel, we have a tradition, we have religious sensibility, that maybe it's easier for us to use the language that for which we can get a widespread agreement and consensus about students in our classes. And so that's a live question. I honestly don't know about that. I don't know whether the Notre Dames or the Boston Colleges or the Villanovas of the world, Loyals, do we have it easier to frame the horizon of significance given our tradition and language? And so I'm going to continue to reflect on that. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Could I please ask people to keep their questions as brief as possible so we can get a few before the session ends?
Hi, I'm Eric Owens. I'm building a little on Mira's question, but I'm interested in hearing some reflections on the cultural specificity of the education you're promoting here around, you know, we speak about diversity on campuses, but also we're talking about global international higher education context here. And much of the language that we're hearing is embedded in Aristotelian insights, et cetera. Could you say a bit about how you approach the sort of formation, both thinking within a community that's quite diverse, but also in comparative contexts across universities around the world?
Great, thanks very much, Eric. We're doing work at Wake Forest. Wake Forest is not a religious institution, it's a pluralistic university, and we have different traditions represented in our work, and so we're trying to provide ways there for students from different backgrounds, cultures, traditions to engage this work and bring their own sources to it. We also are very intentional about having entryways for students from different backgrounds. We lead discussion groups with different people on campus, across traditions, for example, to really make sure people feel welcome to that conversation. And to explore what we can learn from people from different backgrounds on what a virtue means, for example, in a different tradition. That's a very helpful kind of conversation. We're doing also work at Wake Forest across the country with our Educating Character initiative to help other universities think about these questions. And we've been really expansive there in our view what character is. I think many people don't see themselves in the character conversation, but have been forming character for decades, right? And so we've been very focused on making sure that institutions, whether it be HBCUs or HSIs or community colleges, can see themselves in this conversation. And so we've been very encouraged that when you expand the lens of what character might mean and really invite them to say what it means to them, there's much more engagement and interest. So we've been very encouraged. We've now in the last 2 years given out 146 grants to institutions, which is a significant portion of the U.S. Landscape. And so we're very encouraged that they see themselves in this movement and are really articulating in ways that reflect their own institutional priorities.
Veronica, do you want to say something? Because, I mean, obviously you've been working with higher institutions in Latin America.
Yes, thank you. Well, I can tell you that, well, in the Latin American context, like, although this has been work in the Anglo-Saxon world, it has been really well received. We have to be contextualizing what do we mean, for example, character. It has a different connotation. But when you explain what character is, for them it's like a new word just to separate about, because sometimes they can think of character as a strong temper. So when you explain what character is, that is not personality or any other thing, like they start getting it, you know? Or for example, the word virtue. I'm sure that in some contexts, like in Spain, to speak about virtue, it's like, oh my gosh, virtue, it's like terrible, it's moralizing. So, but when you explain to them, okay, you have that concept, but let's go again to explain what virtue really is. This happens through the through how history and we have deformed, what virtue is. Or when we speak about moral education, you are thinking in moralizing, and it's a different thing. Of course, we have been moralizing for centuries, but what do we mean about now having a moral education? Education, it's an intrinsic moral act, we like it or not. So what does that mean? So giving context and explaining things, and I think goes very much with virtue literacy, what they were saying, like in all contexts, people is really open. I've been working with people like in South America, in Mexico, even in Sweden, and in different contexts all over Europe. We have a conference about challenges and opportunities, remember, for character education. And of course, there are different contexts, but it's about how can, it's going again about what is human nature. And when we speak about, there are things that we all resonate regardless our culture, language. So how can we touch those things again? I don't know if...
Somebody at the back, yeah.
Tyler Vanderweel, Harvard University. This question is for Ed and Michael. Thank you both for your presentations. As usual, very helpful and very compelling. However, I wonder if for me and much of the audience, in many ways, this is preaching to the choir. And so I was curious as to whether you might be able to offer practical steps or thoughts on how to get uptake at the institutional level. Certainly distributing your papers to as many as possible will be very helpful, but kind of what more might be done in contrasting your two institutions, Wake Forest, where character and virtue seems to be everywhere, versus Oxford. Could you comment on what happened at Wake Forest to enable that, and what might be needed at Oxford if character language is to be not just at the Oxford Character Project, but really throughout the university?
Thanks, Tyler. So at Wake Forest, we've had focus on character since our founding as part of our founding documents, but it really made more intentional the last 7 or 8 years. And I think I'd say a few things helped with that. One, we had a university president who really made it a priority and really gathered momentum from trustees, from other administrators to really emphasize character as part of our mission at the university. But we also had a culture that's already ready for it. And so people have been doing this work for a long time. We had scholars of character in philosophy and psychology who'd been showing that actually this was not just a feel-good subject. They actually could do research on it and show it actually is a very rigorous topic. That helped faculty see it not just as this sort of warm, fuzzy thing, but actually an academic area of exploration. We also really focused on bottom-up engagement. And so when I came, I was new to this program. I started it at Wake Forest. And so my first year, I had 150 one-on-one meetings with individual people, faculty, staff around the university to really understand their engagement, see what they're already doing, and then to sort of help to find synergies across those different efforts. So I think you need both top-down sort of vision, but you really need bottom-up engagement. If it becomes just a presence initiative that the faculty and staff don't actually own themselves, that actually won't be effective. And so how do you balance sort of the need for leadership, but also really organic work? And so we've done a lot of work with our faculty to help get them engaged in this process. And so we host workshops every summer for faculty to teach design courses on character and leadership from different disciplines, from engineering to neuroscience and literature and history. And we found those 140 faculty now have been through those workshops. And so they are doing it in their own ways, in their own disciplines, in their own context, in ways that fit their own objectives. And that sort of flexibility has helped us actually get more partners into this work. So I think it's kind of a combination of flexibility and coherence, top down and bottom up, that help to make it, I think, institutionally viable in that sense.
And at Oxford, we haven't had the same kind of traction across the university. We'd love that to happen. We've been going with an Oxford Character Project since 2014. What would it take? It's a great question, Tyler. Every institution is different. Oxford is incredibly decentralized, 40 colleges, then all of the divisions and departments where the committees do their work, and power is decentralized to those parts of the university. We started with the students. Where there was incredible appetite, actually just groups of graduate students in a program that connects to them, connects to their aspirations to lead in the world, to the formation of the character, to help them to do that. And we found that a very effective approach. And then just try to think, okay, how are we going to build up bit by bit in different areas of the university? Doing research, for example, on character in business in order to be able to connect into the business school with programs there. Working with colleges now and trying to get cohorts going in across colleges where there's appetite. It's the political work of trying to bring people on board, working with central university priorities where there are pain points for administrators in areas like how do we meet the mental health challenges? The needs are just rising and rising and rising. Well, here can we introduce character to help? What about sport, which is a university priority? So trying to be aware of those things. And then using the university's mission and trying to work back into the university, say, well, these are our priorities. And at Oxford, we have a wonderful university educational mission which talks about developing values and intellectual disciplines to enable students to contribute to society. What's that if it's not about the formation of character? We've used that and done that successfully and applied then internally and been awarded education awards by the Vice-Chancellor and so on. So a combination of bottom-up, engaging in different areas, using research effectively. We're far behind where Wake Forest are in terms of cross-institution impact, but that work needs to be done. We'll keep on trying to do it.
Can I take a stab at that question? I think the low-hanging fruit available to universities is to focus on intellectual virtues. We got some Templeton money at Notre Dame, and we spent a year thinking about what those are and how to implement them. And so it was successfully transforming of our bio sequence in our College of Science. And so intellectual virtues, you can say, are necessary to be a good scientist, a good biologist. And so I think you can convince people who aren't articulate with the language of virtues and character, but if you can convince them that this language helps them become better scientists, I think you get more buy-in that way. And I think that's low-hanging fruit, the intellectual virtues thing.
I don't want to underestimate the work of academics, but I mean, with full respect to the work that we are doing, I think probably the thing which has really raised the profile of the discourse on flourishing and character and virtue in the last few years is the about face of OECD, and with OECD suddenly deciding to make flourishing the aim of education for United Nations rather than the human capital theory from the 1970s. And suddenly we are seeing that ministries of education all around the world who didn't seem to be that interested in flourishing and character before are suddenly showing a huge interest now in these topics. So sometimes policymakers are more influential than us